Good morning and welcome to How to Overcome Your Imposter Syndrome. I see we have a few people have joined us. I know some are running a little late and others will watch the recording. So we will get started. So I'm just getting ready for some screen sharing. So you're all here today because you want to find out a little bit more about how to overcome your imposter syndrome. Before I do that, what I want to do is, first of all, for those of you that haven't used Crowdcast before, is just to explain a little bit about how Crowdcast works. You'll see at the bottom the bottom right of your screen, you've got the chat box. I've already a few comments in there, so please feel free to use the chat box during the session. There will become a point where I like the sessions to be interactive. For you, those who have joined us before, you'll know how this works. What you'll see then is you can also see the list of those people attending. There is a poll section of which I will use a couple this morning. And also what we have is there's a get in touch button here as well. If you'd like to get in touch after the session to find out more about some of the things that we're talking about, please feel free to use the get in touch button and book an appointment with myself, a complimentary 30-minute call. Left of that, you'll see there is Clip Moment. Now, Clip Moment allows you to hit the button and to record a 15-second clip if you'd like to share that on social media. And lastly, ask questions. If you do have any questions, it's probably good if you could put those in the Ask Questions section rather than in the chat box. Because what I can do then is I'll easily find the questions and I'll come to those at the end. But please feel free to use the chat box through the duration of the webinar. Okay, so a little bit about myself for those of you that it might be your first time attending one of my webinars. I've been a business improvement specialist for over 20 years. I specialise in improving psychological flexibility, and I will be talking a little bit about that this morning because it does relate to helping you to overcome your imposter syndrome. I also help with creating psychologically safe workplaces, developing emotional intelligence using the Trait Emotional Intelligence questionnaire, and I also assist organisations in developing their strategic direction, vision, purpose, values, and strategic priorities. So that's enough about me. Let's dive into finding out a little bit more about the imposter syndrome. But before I do that, I mentioned that I have a poll. So at the bottom of your screen where it says poll, I have a question there for you, which is, had you heard of the imposter syndrome before you received communications about this webinar? So if you could take just a moment to answer yes or no, that would be great. Okay. And okay, so great. A number of you had heard about imposter syndrome before attending this webinar, because I've found that some people haven't heard of the imposter syndrome. So knowing a little bit about it, then you may know some of these facts. So imposter syndrome has been around for a long time. It was identified in the 1970s by two psychologists, Suzanne Ames and Pauline Rose Clance. And they said their definition of the imposter syndrome was a psychological pattern of behavior where people doubt their accomplishments and have a persistent internalized fear of being exposed as a fraud. And one of the interesting facts that they found was that it's estimated that 70% of people experience imposter feelings at some point in their lives. So that's quite a huge percentage. So if we think about all of you that are attending here this morning, my guess is that you're probably attending because you have felt that you may experience from imposter syndrome, know others that have, and want to find out a little bit more about it. So this is where I'd like you to get involved with the chat box, and I'd like you to tell me if you think maybe that you might suffer from imposter syndrome. What are some of the signs and symptoms that you believe are part of that imposter syndrome? What might those be? Again, just using the chat box. Okay. Perhaps a little bit shy. Okay, so there's, thank you, lack of confidence, absolutely. So what I'm going to do now is just to share some of the signs and symptoms. So some of those symptoms you may be experiencing is a real feel of failure. These aren't just fleeting emotions. These are fairly consistent emotions that you might be experiencing. It'd be that negative self-talk that you'll hear in your mind. It'll be also dwelling on past mistakes. Feelings of inadequacy and self-doubt. So doubting yourself all the time and doubting your capabilities. Procrastinating, over-preparing, and perhaps overachieving, believe it or not, might be some of those symptoms of imposter syndrome. Now, if we look at those signs and symptoms of imposter syndrome, and then if we think about, okay, so how will that be impacting on your life if those are the signs and symptoms that you are experiencing? And some of those things that you'll find is that you've got lack of confidence, you'll have self-confidence issues. If you've got a fear of failure and you're feeling like a fraud, then experiencing those feelings may also result in some anxiety and stress. And that means that this may also be impacting on your general well-being. Also, if we think about those signs and symptoms that we will experience, could also be impacting on the relationships that we have, perhaps because of the self-talk, perhaps because of the need to over-prepare. Perhaps we work longer hours because of all of that. So again, also impacting on our well-being, but also on the relationships. And it might also be impacting on your career progression because you may be turning down opportunities because you think that you're simply not good enough for those positions. Now, those are the downsides of imposter syndrome, and there may be some upsides to those. Anybody, again, using the chat box, be prepared to share. What do you think might be the upside of having the fear of failure, of feeling that you're going to get caught out, to be a fraud? Is there any upside to any of that? And certainly I feel that there is an upside. And the upside to that is those people who feel that they have the imposter syndrome will never come across as those people who know it all. It can help motivate us to learn, absolutely, or achieve more. So you will be feeling the need to learn and to progress. So you will continuously develop, whereas people who are feeling perhaps overconfident will feel that perhaps they don't need to develop. And they're not worried about getting caught out if they don't know it all, because they'll have a different way of approaching it. So I suppose the real thought with this is, rather than looking at the imposter syndrome as something that is to be feared and something that is bad, I'm going to ask you to look at it in a slightly different way, and is to say that this is something then that helps. It is one of your internal drivers. It is helping you in terms of your self-motivation. It is pushing you and driving you on to achieve more, which is where the overachieving can come in. So that's one way I'd like you to be considering the imposter syndrome. Also, what I'm going to do now is I'm sharing with you some very famous people that have experienced the imposter syndrome. So Albert Einstein, Tom Hanks, Serena Williams, and Meryl Streep. So if you look at these people, they have all hugely achieved in their lives, but they still doubted their capabilities. And so while there is an upside to that, there is also a downside to that. And today is about sharing a way of looking at it that would help you deal and overcome with the imposter syndrome. Before I do that, what I'd like to do is to share a little bit about how the mind works, because that will help in terms of you understanding your imposter syndrome a little bit more. So if I start with the prefrontal cortex of the brain, the prefrontal cortex is the area of the brain where we make our decisions and where we regulate our social behavior. The hippocampus is the area that helps with our memory and learning. And our hippocampus then is connected with the amygdala. So if you think about it in terms of how we live, if we see things and learn from those things that they are what we might perceive as they are good or bad, or they are perhaps dangerous, that is what then is going to help trigger our fight or flight response. And so the amygdala is the part of our brain that detects threats, and that is the area that controls emotion and then will trigger that fight or flight response. So one thing that I would like you to be thinking about in terms of the mind and in terms of your imposter syndrome is that the mind is designed to look for danger. Some of you will have heard me say this before. And the sign of a healthy mind is to have some psychological suffering. Now that might sound strange, but the mind is designed to protect you. It will be scanning and looking for danger. And the danger doesn't come just in the physical sense of the danger, but it also comes in terms of the mental sense. So if you imagine if you're working or perhaps you're delivering a presentation through work or perhaps even in your own personal life, the mind's always looking for where are the faults, where might I fall down? And so you'll feel that sense of adrenaline as you're beginning to start a presentation. And one of the things I'd urge you to think about is that's great. That is the sign of a healthy mind. And so it's great that I am experiencing those things, because what that means is my brain is alive, it is working, and it is doing the job it is required to do. Rather than to see that as something that perhaps we need to panic about and that something's going on that we can't control. So simply acknowledging it and accepting that will help in terms of those feelings and symptoms that you're also experiencing. So in terms of overcoming then your imposter syndrome, what I'd like to do is share a point of view with you. Some of you will have seen this point of view before, and so today we'll be using it in terms of overcoming the imposter syndrome. So the point of view here is the ACT matrix is a behavioral tool that was developed by the ACT matrix itself was developed by Dr. Kevin Polk. And the matrix helps us to sort what we are experiencing. And what I'd like you to do is to try this today with me to see how this helps in terms of, first of all, understanding your imposter syndrome better, and then in terms of ways to overcome it. So in terms of using the ACT matrix, first of all, what I'd like to do is share the experiencing line. So the experiencing line here at the top, we have the 5 senses experience. That is the external world that we live in. And those are things that you'll experience in the external world through your 5 senses. So what you see, what you hear, what you touch, what you taste, what you smell. So those all are the things that you're doing in the world. And when we experience in the external world, really those things flow through us. What I see, what I hear, what I touch, what I taste, what I smell. Because if we think about what we've just talked about with the hippocampus, that's where the learning and the memories come from. Those will then trigger feelings, thoughts, images, and memories. So at the bottom of the experiencing line is where the hippocampus is sitting. That's those range of emotions that we will experience. And so those things that we see, hear, touch, taste, and smell will create those memory sensations, urges. And so it's important that we notice when we are in the internal world and when we're in the external world. Because the world that we live in today, the five senses experiencing world and the internal world have at times become merged or blurred. Because what we experience in the external world, we can often experience those same things in our mind in a very live and vivid way. So I mentioned earlier about delivering a presentation. So I'm sure you can imagine delivering a presentation that you've delivered in the past, or one that perhaps you've even going to be doing in the future. I'm sure you can see those people in the room or on Zoom. I'm sure you can see the presentation. You can start in terms of the presentation to perhaps even feel your heart rate starting to increase, your breath rate increasing also. And so you're not delivering the presentation, but you can see it, you can hear perhaps what you're saying, and you can also experience the emotions, the memories, and the sensations. And so the thing that we need to consider then is, when am I in the internal world and when am I in the external world? Because the mind is such a powerful tool that we can get that sense of fear by simply being in the internal world. So if we then move from the experiencing line into the behavioral line, and the behavioral line has a way or towards. Now, in the case today, we're talking about the imposter syndrome. And really, what we want to be doing is thinking about what would move me towards overcoming my imposter syndrome, because that's what's important to you. That is why you've shown up here today. And on the other side then, on the left side of the matrix, we have what moves me away from overcoming my imposter syndrome. And when we join the two lines then together, the bit in the middle that's important about this matrix is noticing the difference. So noticing when I'm in the internal world and noticing when I'm in the external world, and noticing when I'm moving away from what's important to me. In this case, it's overcoming your imposter syndrome, and towards is then moving towards what is important to overcome your imposter syndrome. And the essential element of noticing is doing this from a non-judgmental and compassionate viewpoint. If you've got the imposter syndrome, then actually the judgments that are being made are very active in your mind. So what I'm asking you to do from today is to start to change your behavior and to start to practice some useful tips and techniques. And that means you will be changing habits that you've had for a long time. And so those won't change overnight. And it's important to realize that. And so if you're not doing what you want to do, it's not to be making the judgment. So the idea of the matrix is we are standing back and looking at this from a different perspective, from a noticing perspective, and looking at simply, what am I noticing? And so what we're going to do now is we're going to walk through the ACT matrix, explaining the matrix from the imposter syndrome perspective. So the first question here that we have when we use the matrix is, when we look at the behavioral line, is who is important and what is important to you in terms of the imposter syndrome. So let's get started. This is where the interactive part of the session occurs. What I'd ask you perhaps to do now is, on a blank sheet of paper in front of you, is to draw the matrix and to think about these questions from your own individual perspective, and at the same time, if you could now use the web chat so that we can really provide some examples here, your own live examples of how this will work. So if we start with overcoming your imposter syndrome, who is important to you in terms of overcoming your imposter syndrome? Who are the important people that this really matters to? I'll give you a moment just in terms of the chat box. Please feel free to share. Me, okay, yes, great, thank you. So myself is important. Is there anybody else that's important in terms of myself and my family? Exactly, because we did talk about relationships could be impacted by your imposter syndrome. So yourself, your family. Who else may be impacted by your imposter syndrome that this would be important to? My team, thank you. So my team and also perhaps some work colleagues. Because that could also even include your boss. Okay, so if we take those three people as important, and I'm glad that we've got me, myself at the top of this. And I ask you now, what is important to you in terms of overcoming your imposter syndrome? So what's important? Again, I'm just going to give you a couple of minutes to put some examples in the chat box. What is important to you in terms of overcoming your imposter syndrome? Okay, I'm going to put a few things in here that I think might be relevant to get us started. So I would say for most of you, you would say success is important. Success or achievement. I would also think that for some of you, in terms of what's important, that also you have fun and enjoyment, because your imposter syndrome may be impacting on that. Also, what might be important to you might be good health. So now that we've got started with a few examples, anybody willing to share a couple of other things that might be important to you? I think the other one that's been mentioned earlier, the opposite of, so is the confidence and being seen as an equal. And so I can be more comfortable. Okay, so comfortable and confident in my abilities, and also growth is one of those things that is also then important. Okay, great. So thank you for sharing. I'm just moving a little bit of this so we can see it. And knowing then who and what is important to us, we're noticing these are the people that my mind is telling me are important to me. I'm noticing that my mind is telling me this is what's important in terms of overcoming my imposter syndrome. If we move over into the bottom left then of the matrix, we're still in the internal world. And in the internal world, the question here is, when you think about your imposter syndrome and when your imposter syndrome is showing up, what unwanted stuff shows up inside that you'd prefer not to experience? So those are things like your thoughts and feelings. So if you would be willing to share, I'd appreciate that now. Again, I can help in terms of getting started here. So some of the things that we might be feeling is self-doubt, the lack of confidence. So some of these things we've been talking about this morning, but what I'm doing now is I'm helping you to sort those experiences using the ACT matrix. So a lack of confidence. And what I'd like you to do is to be thinking about, particularly in the internal world, This is your mind in the internal world. So it is, the feelings are simply feelings. So feelings are data, not directives, is something to think about. Okay, so also in the chat box, I know, so feeling inadequate. So remember, these feelings are data. They are not directives. They are designed to protect you from danger, so that your mind is alerting you to believing I need to know more than I do. So perhaps now, I think, great, what we would get to here are some thoughts. So I need to know more. Okay. And so in terms of that, I need to know more are the thoughts that we experience in the internal world. And one way, in terms of overcoming your imposter syndrome, I'd like you to consider is your thoughts are stories. They are stories that your mind tells you, and they are again designed to protect you from danger. So a bit like the emotions are data, not directives. So when we hear those thoughts in our mind, we can hear them, and then we can decide what we might want to do next. So yeah, I need to know more. Some other things that it might be coming up are I don't belong here. That might relate also to being seen as an equal. It might be I don't deserve this. And you might think I'm a fraud. Okay. So those are some of the internal thoughts that we might be experiencing. Anybody else want to share perhaps some other feelings that might be showing up? Any other feelings? So there might be disappointment might show up for you, in that you might feel like you're not good enough and you mightn't deserve that. Anybody letting people, okay, so fear of I might let people down. Great. Okay, so again, it's our mind telling these things. And when we feel perhaps that, or the thought I should say is, I'm letting people down, or I might let others down, envy others' capabilities. The other thing I was going to say is when we feel that sense of I could be letting people down, we also might get that feeling then of feeling insecure. And when we feel insecure, we can also then feel anxious and even stressed about the situation. So I think I'm getting the sense from the chat box that these are things that you will experience and have experienced and can experience. But perhaps is there some, would there be some reluctance today showing up? Reluctance to share what I might be feeling for fear that others might know that. So I'm going to maybe just put up here is reluctance. The reluctance showing up because I'm fearful of other people knowing how I am feeling. And at the same time, other people may be very willing to share that. So if we move now from the internal world, from noticing what is showing up for me right now when I'm talking about the imposter syndrome, and we move into then the external world. And in the external world, the question in terms of sorting our experience is, when I'm experiencing my imposter syndrome and the unwanted stuff is showing up inside, how do I respond to that? What might I do even to get rid of that? Anybody willing to share with me what you do when those thoughts show up or those feelings show up of self-doubt and feeling inadequate and being disappointed and insecure? How do you cope and deal with your imposter syndrome? What would I see or hear you doing? Okay, great. Stay quiet stay quiet because let somebody else speak, and don't engage. Okay, so another one there is Catherine saying I might eat because of the lack of confidence and the feeling inadequate. So if I stay quiet and don't engage, nobody will know any different. What else might I see you doing? Because there are some of you I will know I have met attending today, others I don't. So would I see any of you perhaps down playing achievements? Oh, that so easy. Oh, that wasn't a problem. Oh, anybody could have done that. Are those things that I would have heard you saying, not put my hand up or stand out? So perhaps not volunteering for projects or for roles because of the fear that's holding you back. So actually, I think the fear is one that I'm just going to add down here at the bottom of the matrix in the bottom left, because fear is one of the things that holds us back. It triggers the fight or flight response, and fear stops us from doing things. So really, there's another one that I've just provided an example of. So we avoid doing because of fear, avoiding and running away. And yeah, okay, so and allowing others to take over. What else might I see you doing when your feelings and thoughts of imposter syndrome show up? Would I see you, great insights. Yes, I will, absolutely, Samantha. I will be sharing the slides. Not only will I be sharing the slides, but one of the things when I covered just a little bit about Crowdcast and how it works, I didn't say is the wonderful thing about Crowdcast is the recording of this webinar will be instantly available as soon as we end the webinar. What that means is you will be able to, using the same link that you used to register and to join the session this morning, you'll be able to use that in terms of watching the recording. And I also will share a copy of the slides. So thank you, Samantha, for that prompt. Yes, great. So checking and rechecking work. So you might over prepare for meetings, and you might take longer with some tasks or reports, for example, because you're doubting your abilities, and so you're checking and rechecking that work. Anything else I might see you doing? So I think one of the things that my guess is for a number of you, would you find it hard to accept compliments? So, you know, I might see people, or sorry, I might hear people saying, oh, that was, as I said earlier, that was easy. When somebody suggests that you've done a great job. So you're downplaying those achievements by saying that was easy, but also you find it hard to accept compliments. You might feel I generalize when I talk about females, but there may be many females on this call today that if somebody pays them a compliment, even in terms of how they look, they'll say, oh, sure, this thing, I've had that for years. Rather than simply accepting the compliment. One of the things, again, the fact that you're here, my guess is that you will feel that you suffer from imposter syndrome or know others that have. And so one of the other things that I will know that you probably do as well is you set ambitious goals. So those people that have imposter syndrome have high levels of self-motivation. As I said earlier, they're driving themselves all the time. So Richard, sorry, I'm just going to have a quick read at Richard's comments here. Suggest this app that I'm using when I'm joining any online event. And this is like electronic. Okay, excellent. Richard, thank you so much. I didn't know that myself. So this is an automatic note taker that transcribes everything that is spoken in the meeting. Hope you find this helpful. Richard, thank you for sharing. That's just wonderful. And so there's lots of things now that we know that we do in response to. And what I'm just going to do just is a visual illustration of remembering that when the stuff that's showing up inside that we don't want to experience, there will always be an external consequence. I will do something as a result of experiencing the internal stuff. And so people will see me doing something, and that may be that you're doing things to hide some of the imposter syndrome. The other thing that I'd like to do now is to also share with you from this perspective, this point of view with the ACT matrix, is quite often when we do things as a result of the internal stuff showing up, we're doing things in the external world, that then can also then create some of the same feelings and thoughts and emotions that we experience in the bottom left of the matrix. So in other words, if I stay quiet and don't engage and I come out of a meeting, how might I now be feeling? How might I now be feeling if I've gone to a meeting and I didn't engage and I allowed others to take over? I might be feeling disappointed in myself. There's a bit of self-talk going on there and saying, why didn't you do that? That was really stupid of you not to jump up and say something. So regret that I didn't speak up. So there's another great word that I'm going to add in here as well. So regret is now showing up. So what we're finding now with the visual diagram of the arrows here is what you'll see is we start to create now a vicious cycle. A vicious cycle of regret shows up and disappointment in myself showing up. And now I have to do something to get rid of that feeling. And ultimately, that is the nature of being human. And so what I'm asking you today is to notice who and what is important is a big question. So I want you to notice who is important, what is important, noticing the internal stuff that's showing up in terms of the imposter syndrome, noticing what you're doing as a result of that showing up, noticing how you're responding to it. And then over here in the top right, the next stage of the matrix then is to ask the question about what could I do that moves me towards who is important. So again, just we're noticing what could I do that would move me towards who and what is important. In this case, one of the most important people is yourself in terms of overcoming the imposter syndrome. So what are some of the things that you think you could do to overcome your imposter syndrome? So we're saying, I'm just going to make a note here, is notice what's important. Notice what's important. Notice what's showing up. And notice how I want to respond. Okay, so it's noticing those things. I'm very, very reluctant to use the word choice. And there is a very good reason for that. Because I asked you when I explained about the ACT matrix to notice from a non-judgmental and compassionate viewpoint. And really when we talk about choices then, choices become judgments that this is a good choice or a bad choice. So I'm simply asking you to notice how you want to respond to what is showing up. And also when we notice we create a little bit of psychological distance. So one of the things when we talk about ACT, as I said, the matrix is a sorting matrix, but this is a well-known and well-proven global behavioural framework. So one of the things that we can do is to do the I am noticing, I am having the thought that, and ... that I don't belong here, I don't deserve this. Because there is a real difference in those statements that we have on the bottom left of the matrix, which is, I need to know more. Sounds like a fact. I don't belong here. Sounds like reality. I don't deserve this, and this is true. So hear the negative thought and straight away turn it into a positive one, create it into positive affirmations and repeat them regularly. So that's certainly one possibility. Monica, what I would suggest maybe you also try is just trying to distance yourself from the thought. So rather than preventing the thought, because if we try to push the thought away, then the frequency of the thought increases. So what I'm asking you to do is to try some new things to notice what works for you. Because what we find is Monica's given us some suggestions of what works for her. And perhaps there are others that will soon provide some suggestions on what works for them. But what you need to do is to try what works for you, is to notice, is this moving me in the direction of overcoming my imposter syndrome, being successful in achieving, having fun and enjoyment, and having good health and confidence? This is about you. And again, it is about being happy and comfortable with you. And if other people make judgments, and they are their judgments, but they are not yours, and noticing how their judgments make you feel and how you want to respond to those. So even just using that, I'm noticing I'm having the thought that, or I'm noticing I am feeling that, is just to say that even into yourself when you're experiencing it. The other thing that we talked about in terms of the complements on the left side of the matrix in terms of behaviours. So it could be then what we could do is just accept compliments without the bit at the end, oh, that. So just simply thank you. So trying to practice that, finding opportunities even to practice that over the next couple of days or weeks. And that's what I'm asking you to do, is to see if you could look for opportunities to practice some of the towards moves. Not only the towards moves, but the important bit is to notice the away moves. Notice when I'm moving away. I'm not scolding yourself and not beating yourself up, but simply noticing that was an away move. Why was that an away move? What emotions and thoughts showed up inside that prompted me to act in that way? Because again, if you were talking to a friend or colleague who felt they suffered from imposter syndrome, you would show them some kindness and compassion, and you would be kind when they tell you how they're feeling. And so it's the self-talk with kindness and compassion. And it's also about, perhaps when we talk about unrealistic goals, is set realistic goals. It might be as well, I think one of the good things is to do a personal SWOT. So what are my strengths? What are my weaknesses? What opportunities are there? What would threaten my imposter syndrome or my progress in work? So doing a personal SWOT, being aware of those things that you are good at. And earlier, I think it was Catherine mentioned the growth. So learning and growing. So seeing what's going on the left side of the matrix as a learning opportunity. I have noticed that. As humans, we are not perfect. So this is about showing up and appreciating and understanding that we are not perfect, And that when we make mistakes, we learn from those mistakes and we can do something about those, rather than trying to beat ourselves up about those and saying that's really exposed ourselves. So acknowledging and accepting, sometimes, when I say noticing what's showing up, is naming the emotions that are showing up is also useful. Is noticing the emotions where they are showing up and how they feel. So getting to know those emotions is your friend. It's not seeing those emotions as your enemy. Those of you that have joined me before will understand that when we talk about emotions from an ACT perspective, we do not talk about emotions being positive or negative. We talk about them being helpful or unhelpful in a given context. Because if we think about those things that we have listed, those emotions that we have listed in the bottom left of the matrix, fear, regret, reluctance, self-doubt, we talked about earlier, there is an upside to those things, and that is they are pushing you on. Fear is great to experience if you're in a burning building. It's good to experience some sense of fear if you're applying for a new job or you're providing a presentation to a group of people that you've never done so, because it shows that you care. So when I prepare, I get ready for Crowdcast, I am feeling that little sense of adrenaline running, because it's human to want it to work well. It's human to want to make sure that I'm doing the right thing to connect with you guys, because you have taken an hour out of your schedule today to be here and to learn about something that really matters to you. So the emotions are not bad and not good. They are useful or helpful or unhelpful in a given situation. So it's thinking about that. And it is for you to decide whether something is wanted or unwanted. And it is you to decide whether it's an away or towards move, because this is about you. It is about what is important to you, not what is important to other people. So it might be also in terms of towards move is asking others for help. It might be about having a support network. Anybody else willing to share now that we've got a few ideas here, which I'm just going to highlight these in bold that we can do to move towards. Any other suggestions of things that people could do or that you're currently doing that move you towards overcoming your imposter syndrome? I think one of the things that I've talked about is also embracing emotions and learning from them, rather than seeing them as something that might be problematic. So really getting to know your emotions, becoming friends with them, knowing those feelings, knowing how you experience those, and knowing where exactly even those show up within your body. Being able to scan and to notice when you're feeling fearful or self-doubt. Is it in your head? Is it in your stomach? Do you feel your heart racing? Do you feel your palms getting sweaty? So one way that you could also get to know and embrace those emotions is to sit quietly, even in a room, and to think about your imposter syndrome, to let it show up, and to sit in just that quiet space and to notice what your mind is saying, to notice what you're feeling and where you're feeling it, and getting to know those different emotions and where they're showing up. And so I suppose the actions in terms of moving towards, these are things that I would see or hear you doing. I think that's important to remember when we're thinking about behaviors and the away and towards. Those are things that I would see or hear you doing to move towards or away from what's important. And one of the things that I would ask you to look for opportunities to use the ACT matrix to record what you're experiencing. So not only what you're then experiencing, but how you're behaving as a result of that. And really, you can do the ACT matrix on a daily basis. You can do it on a weekly basis. But what I would do is I'd ask you to try to do the ACT matrix even on a daily basis over the next few days if you find the opportunity to do that. Because when we all know in terms of learning that it's the use it or lose it. And the statistics are frightening about the percentage of what we lose should we not use that learning within 24 hours. So I'd ask you, and that's where I'm hoping that through this webinar, you've been sitting with a sheet of paper in front of you. You've been drawing the ACT matrix. You've been noting what you would experience, what you're noticing, because this is all general. This isn't about you. And this is just a general sense of combining everybody's thoughts and ideas. And when you're doing that, it is important with the ACT matrix to be thinking about workability. So the noticing, the away and the towards is about noticing behaviours that move us in a particular direction. So are my behaviours moving me towards that chosen direction, overcoming my imposter syndrome, or am I moving away from it? So if I'm not doing the ACT matrix, am I avoiding it? Or if I'm over preparing, is that really helping me moving towards what's important to me? The who and what's important to me. And is what I'm doing working for me? Is it getting me to where I want to go to? And I've highlighted the point at the bottom of this slide that I highlighted earlier. And that is workability is not about judgments and it's not about right or wrong. It's about noticing the actions and the consequences that follow. Noticing, is this working for me? And if it's not, is looking for another action, moving. If staying in the internal world is causing you more anxiety and stress, then it's time to move out of the internal world and to be doing something in the external world, because it's hard to experience both. So move from that internal world to the external world. Get out and do something with your 5 senses. Notice your breathing. When you're out for a walk, some of you will have heard me talking about, rather than out walking with your self-talk, is notice what you see around you. What do I see? What do I hear? What can I feel? Even being aware of your clothes rubbing as you're walking, your feet pounding on the pavements. Being aware of all of that can move you from the internal world to the external world, and really notice about what's working for you. What I mentioned at the start of the Crowdcast, again, for those of you that maybe joined us slightly later, at the bottom of your screen, there is a little button for you to hit, which is book your 30-minute complimentary session. So if you want to get in touch to find out more about how the ACT matrix could work for you, if you'd be interested in some coaching that would help you with your imposter syndrome, simply click that button and it will allow you to book a date and time with myself to discuss your needs and to agree an approach moving forward. For those of you that found this morning useful and are interested in knowing more, the next webinar that I'll be running is how to manage emotions in the workplace. That will be on Thursday, the 15th of April at 10 o'clock. Another one that I haven't scheduled, but I will be, because I'm hearing more and more people talking about it, and that is about how to avoid burnout in the workplace, because that is something that I think everybody has got very fed up with, this world that we're living in, where we're all restricted in terms of our movements, and we're operating in the virtual world. And so I think it might be useful to share again some tips and techniques around avoiding burnout in the workplace. One way that you can keep in touch with those different webinars that I'm running is you can either follow me on Twitter or LinkedIn. You can also follow me, you can hit the follow button on Crowdcast, and that means you'll also be notified of any new webinars that I will be running. I've also provided you with my website, email address and telephone number. If you'd like to know more, please feel free to use any of those. what I'd like to do is to say thank you. I'm just going to come back and check now. We haven't any questions. So this is your opportunity before we finish up in the next couple of minutes, just to ask me some questions. Thank you, Sharon. Thank you, Monica, for attending. Thank you for joining us. I hope you found it useful. Remember that this Crowdcast is recorded, so you can replay it again if you want to go back on some of those useful tips and techniques. Thank you to Richard for sharing that great suggestion. Any questions for me? Okay, in the absence of any questions, I'm saying thank you. Thank you, Jimmy. And thank you everyone for your comments and getting involved and engaged as I asked. That was really great. And I'll hang on for a few minutes just in case anybody does. A little bit hesitant in terms of asking those questions. So thank you. Have a great day. And practice the ACT matrix if you can to overcome your imposter syndrome. Good luck. Thanks, Alex.